Nile Rodgers, Finding the Funk, take one.
Oh, hold on. Second sticks. Let's do it again.
Okay.
There you go.
Nile Rodgers, Finding the Funk, take one.
Excellent. Hi, sir.
Hey. Oh, I see your reflection. Come towards me. Good.
Okay. Funk music. If someone had you to define funk, what would you say?
Wow, that's a little bit different for me to hear because I can't really define funk because there's no specific style of funk that would be definitive as far as I'm concerned. There's so many, like I could listen to music and I'd say that that's funk. I would say that that's funk influenced or that's funky or it has a funky sound. I know many people who would call songs like Sissy Strut funk, but what happened was for me, as funky sounding music developed, I started to call music that was funk music more like the harder style funk in the tradition of the Midwest bands or Parliament Funkadelic or the West Coast bands. So it had a certain harsh sound to it as opposed to just R&B that was funky, so to speak. It's interesting. I'm not so sure I would call James Brown funk as much as I would call James Brown funky. Like he was like the king of funky, but because of my age, when I started calling music funk music, it was mainly band oriented, Ohio players, Kinsman Daz, bands like that. They were funk bands.
If you had to define, then let's talk about what artists. Sure, what artists, to your point of view, embody funk to you?
I would have to say my all-time favorite funk unit was probably Parliament or Graham Central Station. But once again, man, I'm just not a superlative kind of person because so many funk bands really influenced me. Confunction, like I said, Daz Band, Charlie Daniels, come on, Fantastic Voyage.
Lakeside.
Oh my God, Lakeside would kill him. Heat Wave was funky. I mean, there was a time where it seemed like Ohio was coming up with a new funk band every other week, and then we had the New York style of funk that was an imitation to me spiritually of West Coast and Midwest funk. Cameo. When I first heard Cameo, I had no idea they were from New York. I thought they were like West Coast or the Midwest, but they had the style of that type of funk. So there was regional funk. When I first started playing, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm born in New York. There were bands like the Buckeye Politicians. Believe it or not, Lionel Richie's band.
Oh, the Commodore.
When the Commodores first started, let me tell you something. People, because Lionel Richie, as he developed, he got more Vegas and stuff like that. But I'm gonna tell you something right now. I'm gonna go on record. There was a time where the Commodores would come to New York City and put fear in the hearts of bands, and I'm talking the Buckeye Politicians, Willie Feaster and the Mighty Magnificents, all of these hardcore funk bands, the bands that became BT Express. The Commodores come to town, it's like you better make sure you play 3 or 4 acts before the Commodore, because they were funky. And not only were they funky, they were a funk band. They played funk music that was a hard drive and funk. So once again, it's almost like trying to define soul. You know what I mean? It's like, it's so all over the place, it's so regional, and it's also artist specific. And I think for me, the thing that just absolutely breaks my heart is that funk became the foundation, from my point of view, of black music. It was because in order to play funk, you had to have a band. And in white music, you had rock and roll bands. And when a rock band would get signed, they were what we call self-contained. They wrote their own songs, blah, blah, blah. If they didn't do all that stuff, they didn't get signed. Like very rarely did a rock band get signed and say, well, like, now let's go out to songwriters and get songs. Funk bands were self-contained units, and they were the mainstay of the black music business. Of course, we still had the singing groups, but funk became the bedrock of the band, because once you signed the band, you got a songwriter, you got an arranger, you got an orchestrator, and all that stuff. So you just signed that band, and economically, it was powerful. So that's what I grew up idolizing. I'm young enough let me say I'm old enough. I'm old enough to have appreciation for Motown and stuff like that, but they were not really self-contained acts except for one or two. But after the Motown era, black music was based on the self-contained band, and they were funk bands. No band sounded like the Ohio Players. You could learn an Ohio Players song, but you didn't sound like them because you had to be the Ohio Players to play that.
You know, I was talking about your journey. You come up a lot when people talk about rhythm guitar. I mean, so everyone, other guitar players. I was curious how influenced you were. What guitarist, or what influenced the sound that you developed as a guitar player?
It was all the funk guys, of course. It was, when I first started listening to, Kool and the Gang, and I first started listening to James Brown. I mean, think about all of the funky James Brown records that had no keyboard players on it. There were just two guitars, and it was funky, funky, funky. And I started to think to myself, that's what I want to be like. I want to be the guy that can be in the band and hold down the groove by myself with just a bass player and a drummer. And I developed a style that locked the funk part of it down, so that the keyboard players, if you notice in Chic records and all my compositions, the funk part of it comes from me and the bass. The keyboard players are just playing what we call footballs. They're just playing dun, dun, and we're playing the we got all the funk going on in my part. And that's because of all the people that I idolize. That's because of, listening to James Brown and listening to Kool and the Gang, listening to Earth, Wind and Fire, listening to Al McKay, and Rufus. When I first heard Tony Maiden, I was like, I gotta get that. So there were these people that were coming along after I had already developed my style, and then they just helped me to redefine it, because I was mainly a jazz guitar player. So I was able to take my knowledge of harmony and start to put their rhythmic thing in it and start to speak melodies with my chord playing. Like, if you notice with normal guitar players, no matter who they are, whether they're funk guitar players, rock guitar players, whatever, whenever they play a part, that's their part. If you watch me play a part, I never play just the part. Like, if I play Good Times, you just hear that first, but you listen to the record, I'm all over the neck. I never stop. And that's because of my jazz background.
So one of the interesting things I want to get you're uniquely positioned to talk about is disco versus funk.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things interesting for me listening to Chic in this, I always gravitated to you guys because I never felt you were disco, quote unquote, with a stereotypical disco.
Right.
Because I felt there was a punch and there's a power to it. I always felt like you guys managed somehow to address what disco needed, but without sacrificing the rhythm.
Funk.
Yeah. How did talk about that philosophy musically?
It's mainly because we wanted to be a funk band. But what happened was we realized that being New Yorkers, there was no, in my mind, there was no such thing as a New York funk band. Like we didn't know any. We didn't, like I said, we didn't realize Cameo were local guys. We didn't know that. Sure, I knew M2May. Sure, I knew all the bands from out in Queens. They were all my boys. We all grew up together. But in my heart, I didn't think of those guys as legitimate funk bands. They played funky stuff, but they were more sort of on the esoteric trip. They were, Mother Night and those kind of guys. Senya Roaches, the Julie Nixon. They were more political kind of, and they used funky elements in the tradition of Mother's Finest, but not hardcore funk. Like they didn't, just slam the one. So what we did was we decided that if there was a band from New York and they were considered a funk band, they had to be what we called, and we made up the name, we called ourselves Sophisto Funk. We couldn't just be normal funk, we had to be a different type of funk. And the concept was, when a lot of black artists make it, especially in jazz, which is my primary background, at least that's how I fantasize myself, visualize myself. So black artists, we make it, we get to go to Europe or particularly France, and they embrace us as normal citizens, great musicians, great artists. Nina Simone's like a queen in France. So we thought, wow, why don't we act like we're from France and we come back to America? That way we can cut out the middleman. We don't have to get big in America and move to France. We would be big in France and move back to America, and then that would be cool right from the jump. So that's how we came up with the concept